to introduce Dr. Diane Howard. Diane is an old friend of mine. I think we met in Valencia, Spain. See? Valencia, yeah, Valencia, Spain. I'm using my Castilian, my bad Spanish accent. So we met, gosh, that was a long time ago, yeah, in Spain, at an IEC, in fact. Diane is currently the Director of Commercial Space Policy at the National Space Council in the Executive Office of the President, which is chaired by Vice President Kamala Harris. And so this is an august position. All of us that work here in Washington Space Policy, when we have problems, concerns, things we want to do, we go talk to Diane and the National Space Council, right? And we try to figure it out. So she's an attorney. She previously served as chief counsel for space commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce, my old agency, and she was a professor, adjunct professor. I think you're at UT Austin now. Still at UT Austin, and before that, she taught at Embry-Riddle for a number of years. Had a ton of her students came and interned for me, so it was really great to see that. She's one of the experts on space law that I know of in the world. She's got a real passion for the business of space, for the space sector, and I'm glad that you're there in the job at the White House. So welcome, Diane Howard.
How's that? Good, thank you. Well, thank you, Clay. Thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me. Thanks, Brad, for being at the helm and giving me an opportunity to introduce your on-orbit activities panel. So and I got to meet quite a few of you, although not all of you. So you're going to hear a little of the professor come out in me as I explain a little bit about what we've been doing with regard to on-orbit activities. So it's no secret that National Space Council has been deep in thought about emerging in-space capabilities that come out of those on-orbit activities for quite some time. And you've heard Clay talk about some of this. So I'm going to expound a little bit about what we're doing to sort of try to avoid those flights of opportunity and things like that. There are, as Clay also mentioned, a lot of shifting paradigms in the roles between, and the responsibilities between the actors in space missions. So we've been hard at work trying to figure out how we can be more responsible as we move forward. Ever since the Vice President formally tasked us to do that, to come up with a plan for a framework and to include safety and sustainability norms and protocols, which kind of goes to that last pillar that Clay was talking about for his agenda. So we've been involved in these conversations at all levels because these are issues that can affect a goodly portion of industry at a time when we are actively committed to partnering between government and the private sector, and at a time when we rely more heavily on space capabilities across the board, as do our partners and also our competitors. And in an environment that is far more congested, all that debris, all those satellites, and far more competitive. So even back in the 60s, when the United States was front and center, told you the professor and me was going to come out, when the United States was front and center with negotiations for the Declaration of Principles and ultimately the Outer Space Treaty, we knew, the United States knew, that the private sector would be important partners. This was the early days of our first iteration of Intelsat and ComSat. The United States negotiated for the inclusion of and the permission for non-governmental space activities, private sector space activities. And that resulted in a very famous article of the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6, which gives states international responsibility for private sector space activities and obligates those states to authorize and supervise those activities. And we enacted laws and rules to do just that. But those rules were from that time, a different space age. So nearly a year ago, at Chabot Space and Science Center in California, we introduced the Vice President to quite a few companies who are developing and flying new capabilities that don't fit squarely into the regulatory buckets that now exist at the FAA for launch and reentry, at the FCC for spectrum, and at NOAA for remote sensing. she decided that it was time for these rules to evolve, to be flexible, but to be clear, to enable American innovation, American leadership, American economic opportunity. And this is in keeping with something that we have here in the United States called the Space Priorities Framework, which came out in December 2021, and which says that the United States will foster a policy and a regulatory environment that enables a competitive and burgeoning, that means flourishing, thriving, U.S. commercial space sector. Not enough just to have it, but it's got to do good, okay? And that we will clarify government and private sector roles and responsibilities and support a timely and responsive regulatory environment. Things aren't going to take forever or go into a black box, and must provide clarity and certainty for the authorization and continuing supervision of non-governmental space activities, including for novel activities. So to clarify, when we talk about novel activities, we're talking about the space things that aren't now directly supervised, because we don't know what we don't know, right? We can't make a list of all the things because God only knows what they're going to be. Hopefully they're going to be things we can't even imagine, right? So some of these activities are novel in and of themselves, and they represent missions that have never before been performed. But others are things that are performed, that used to be performed by governments in the past, but are now being performed by the private sector for government or for commercial purposes. So things like the commercial LEO destinations, that is, Clay's second job. So why do we care? Well, to start with, our U.S. government missions benefit from reduced costs and increased capabilities that are enabled by current and emerging commercial space activities. So the U.S. government benefits. And if those activities are chilled or delayed because of regulatory uncertainty, then the government might not be able to leverage those capabilities. Our U.S. private sector is already engaged doing these things. We see it in commercial human spaceflight, the partnerships between NASA and private companies to build habitats and space stations, and within space servicing missions, manufacturing and assembly in space, fueling stations on orbit, new sensing techniques and technologies from space, and planned for partnerships for missions to the moon, on the moon, and eventually beyond the moon. So currently, we have no formal or standardized process to authorize and supervise those novel things, precisely because they aren't directly supervised under the existing regulatory environment. And that has led to a lack of clarity as to which department or agency would or should be responsible for authorizing and supervising them. So somebody asked me a question during our long networking break about this. I said, well, we're going to get there. So this is, we're there, we're at the sweet spot. So the National Space Council is responsible for ensuring the U.S. capitalizes on the rich opportunities that are presented by our nation's space activities, including those exciting, emerging private sector capabilities. And by capitalizing on these opportunities, we mean maintaining and expanding U.S. leadership, keeping Americans safe, and capturing the benefits of space for Earth. Our 2021 U.S. Space Priorities Framework highlights the importance of regulatory clarity and certainty, particularly of roles and responsibilities, in achieving those lofty goals. So what do we care about? I told you why, but what? Well, we'll start with Outer Space Treaty Article 6 obligations. And I'll tell you, never ever, when I was in grad school, did I imagine that, Article 6 from the Outer Space Treaty would become a part of like nerdy, geeky vernacular, but here it is, and here we are. But how we meet the obligation to authorize and supervise is important. Future space activities could be really different from current ones, right? And the development of a rigid regulatory framework would likely be detrimental to adapt to those new activities. So flexibility, that's something we care about, that's something that's important to us. And further to the points I've already made, so is predictability. We care about sustainability. As novel capabilities and new missions are being placed in space, we must consider how they impact our future exploration and use of the space environment. But also yours and your kids and their kids as part of our oversight processes. It can't be an afterthought. It has to be baked in. So that's something we care about. We care about leadership. We care about being good global role models. We're not the only nation that's looking at regulatory issues. We just heard from you about Qatar. And boy, you and I should talk later because I have a host of things to share with you about capacity building for sure. In some cases, it's to promulgate new laws, and in other cases, it's to update, like we're doing here in the US. And multiple other countries have emerging commercial space sectors that do include some of these novel activities, things that we're not directly regulating, but neither are they. Some of these countries are starting to outline their regulatory frameworks for in-space operations. So achieving regulatory interoperability with our international allies and friends is key to our success and their success. That's something we care about. And we know that practices and standards are key foundational components of our work in this area, and they make interoperability that much more feasible. So this comes from the Space Priorities Framework, too. It's sort of like the guiding light. It's our lodestar. To create free and fair market competition internationally, the United States will work with allies and partners to update and harmonize space policies, regulations, export controls, and other measures that govern commercial activities worldwide. So I'm going to close with a little bit about what we're doing about all this. So nearly a year ago, we organized that commercial space event at Chabot that I mentioned earlier, where Vice President Harris discussed novel capabilities with a number of private sector representatives. And she came away from that and said, she directed us. She said, National Space Council, you are going to engage with the private sector stakeholders to start thinking about how we can future-proof our regulatory framework. And shortly after that, about a month later, we had our second National Space Council meeting in Houston. And there, she requested that departments and agencies, federal government departments and agencies, would begin work on a proposal for authorizing and supervising novel private space sector activities. But she said not only should it be clear and predictable, it should also include how we're going to ensure that space operations are safe and sustainable. So we've come a long way. After many interagency meetings at multiple levels, 3 listening sessions with robust participation from the public sector, multiple spoken comments, many written comments, and for all of you students who are just getting into the research of space, particularly space policy, I invite you to go to regulations.gov and just type in novel space activities, and you'll get I think there's 43 written comments, and it's really a wide and diverse array of stakeholders, and you'll get a great cross section of some really good thought leadership on these ideas. So I invite you to look that up. So the good news is that the interagency has come to an agreed way forward. It's huge. If any of you had been around for the last 10 years plus, and there's a few in the audience that have been, I see Margaret over there, who's been part of a lot of these interagency discussions then and now, have been, know that this is really a big deal. So I really can't tell you the specifics of what it looks like because we don't know exactly what it's going to look like when it comes out the other side. There's lots of little details, but I can tell you that it's given me a new appreciation for consensus as a tool for taking decisions. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody's in absolute agreement. It just means the decisions taken are, it doesn't even mean that they're unanimous in the level of support you have for them. What it means is there's no raised objections, so you can move forward. However, and compromise is really key to that. However, I can tell you that this particular consensus reflects synthesis of multiple points of view. So it's not just dumbing it down. This is like everybody's stuff got taken into consideration. That's pretty enormous. So equities and interests from executive branch regulators, like the FAA, like the Department of Commerce, NOAA, and even the FCC, which is not executive branch, but we've included them, but also U.S. government operators, NASA and DoD and the intelligence community, and from the State Department with its macro understanding of our treaty obligations, and the international community, which is impacted by all of our space activities. So this really is a whole of government undertaking. It really has to be. And that leads me to the last point that I want to make today, and one that flows from consensus and the goodness that comes from buy-in across stakeholders, as well as the need to communicate bidirectionally. We've come to terms with the fact that consensus is increasingly difficult when your stakeholder community is large and diverse. The long-term sustainability work at the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses for Outer Space certainly illustrates this, and it continues to do so. But this doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for it, work toward it. At the end of the day, we have 21 very useful guidelines currently in implementation around the world. And they're providing more opportunities for international cooperation and capacity building, which is what you need in Qatar right now, capacity building. The consensus challenge also surfaces another reality. We talk a lot about space, STEM, and workforce. In fact, a number of you came and visited us at the White House the other day, and we had a really great discussion about it. And we have to have pathways for the next iteration of space workers to develop themselves in support of our burgeoning, flourishing, thriving space economy. We talk about skill sets. The ones and zeros, the coding, the engineering, scientific process. We finally expanded the conversation to include technicians, but just as important in our skill sets is the art of listening. We can't effectively collaborate and negotiate if we don't hear and understand each other. And the flip side of this is the art of communication. I get teased all the time for using lots of words to describe nuance, and I can take it, but I'm not going to stop using my voice. Speak up. We need to work on developing our transmit and our receive skills, and those of our incoming workforce, all of you, okay? These are innate skills for some, but anyone can learn them, okay? So you have a really good lineup of speakers coming for your on-orbit activities panel, and they're going to talk about business models and policy implications from their esteemed perspectives. But I want to thank you for letting me tell you a little bit about ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Appreciate having you here. Appreciate all the work you and your team are doing at the White House and the Space Council to push these key issues forward. So thank you. I know it was a busy time for you to make time to be here for us today. So next